How the Korean War created Samsung. Hello guys, welcome back to our channel Wealthy. Who doesn't recognize Samsung, the popular electronics brand? But do we know how it was created? Surprisingly, it all happened because of the Korean War. Let's dive into know the exact situation. Samsung is one of the leading tech organizations globally, and like other American competitors, including Dell and Apple, it was not formed in a college's dorm room or a garage. That's surprising but true. Samsung came into existence in the wake of a highly destructive war, the Korean War. The first half of the 20th century was not that kind of Korean people, as after hundreds of years of political interference, the Japanese people reduced Korea to a puppet state. Imagine that Japanese organizations were brutal, with various business people and farmers being driven off to their lands and other works. Japan was waiting to set Korea with its people, and that's why Japanese ownership of Korean land skyrocketed from 8% to 50% in 1930. For a time, people thought that the Korean nation was destined for oblivion. Despite forcing the Koreans to change their names, the Japanese also prohibited the schools from teaching Korean as a language. It took the defeat of Japan during the Second World War when Korea became independent again. Surprisingly, in 1945, Korean people were optimistic despite all the chaos of the Soviet military administration and the American administration. Lee Byung-chul was one such optimist who started his own business during the Japanese occupation. He created a tiny transportation organization in 1938, known as Samsung, specializing in exporting groceries. When the Korean War occurred, Samsung had a massive competitive advantage. One was its location in Masan, the city situated on the southeastern coast, that the Japanese used as their port to transport exploited Korean resources. While the Japanese period for Samsung was decent and the newly independent nation, South Korea presented immense opportunities for him. Those years after liberation became profitable for every Korean business person for one simple reason. When the Japanese administrators left the nation, they left their assets. The Korean government was handing them out to rebuild the country. Everything was great, but then the Korean War came, and the invasion of North Korea turned into a proxy war between the capitalist West and the Soviet bloc. The war took place with modern weapons, destroying cities and industrial centers in South Korea. Most of the factories were destroyed during the 3 years of a long war, and 60% of chemical and textile facilities were destroyed. At the end of this war, the infrastructure of Korea was required to repair, and its organizations were not that capable of sustaining the economy. This time, it was obvious for the increment in prices as the South Korean government forcibly printed more money to finance countries, vast military expenditures, and more. Moreover, hyperinflation was so extreme that in July 1953, Korean money was in circulation and was 24 times greater than before. The future of Samsung in South Korea was increasingly uncertain, but Uncle Sam had their back. After the Korean War, the US created the Marshall Plan's Korean version following the United Nations suit. Throughout the 1950s, about $3 billion USD were sent to the Korean government, who then chose the organizations worthy of investment, and Samsung was one of them to benefit from this relief. In fact, the state hope that Samsung got during the tenure was so amazing. At that time, there were strict limits on exports, but Samsung attained a free pass to the government, and then it became the biggest exporter of scrap iron. Funneling the relief money from America to Samsung allowed it to expand even more from just a transport company to a manufacturing firm. In 1953, they started manufacturing flour and sugar and then got to textiles a year later. Samsung grew such a lucrative business from purchasing the destroyed factories with US money and rebuilding them to generate 93% annual revenue during the 1950s. However, that relief aid was part of the picture, as the Korean government was also expanding the credits to Samsung at competitive rates. Lee was one of the biggest beneficiaries of the Korean government at that time, and once he got the money, he turned and started buying the banks from which he obtained it. By the end of that decade, Samsung took over 3 banks with his friend and branched out chemicals and insurances. The organization grew so large that not any revolution could bring it down. Hence, when the military overthrew his friend in 1961, he was not that worried. Under the new administration, the Korean economy broadened up and focused on export growth, for which Samsung was a perfect partner. The popular Samsung division we know today was made with government help. In 1969, the government passed legislation to reduce tax by 50% on organizations operating in the electronics business that Samsung Electronics created the same year. During the 70s, Samsung became a Korean modernization symbol and helped bring washing machines and televisions to people. From them, it jumped to semiconductors and now smartphones. None of this would have been possible without the brilliant positioning of Lee. Moreover, even today, the government and Samsung go hand in hand, and it is now the biggest division in Popular on an international level. So that was how the Korean War created Samsung. Isn't it commendable? Lee was so brilliant and intelligent that he thought of all the things during that situation. Let us know your views in the comments below. Until the next video, stay tuned and subscribe.